We have a few questions that we compiled with the Radical Urban Lab. Some of them are a little bit bonkers, feel free to ignore them, absolutely. You have the right to pass. To be judged here, that's completely fine. So let's start. First of all, Colin, what makes a city?
What makes a city is an excellent small start to the questions. So I would say, what makes a city? I would say densification, right? So like a densification of different kinds of things. Capital, labour, culture, materiality, right? The kind of concentration and bringing together of things in space has to be somewhere early on in any definition of what a city is, the kind of idea of densification. And of course, densification is not just in sight, it's also a relationship to myriad places all across the world, economic, social, political, environmental relations that are folded into that place. So that's important. I think cities are also, secondly, contingencies, by which I mean they constantly, because they throw together these densifications, they constantly generate both routine repetitions and surprises. Tweaks, odds, permutations, strange lines of flight, whether it's in culture or politics, where surprises happen and you encounter those surprises as you move around them, right? So there's something about density, there's something about contingency, and I think the last thing I would say, the third thing I would say, is that there is also something about a shared sense of the identity of the place, even if that sense of shared identity is contested, differentiated, not universally shared in the city or beyond it, but a sense that it has a certain kind of, sometimes it's called spirit, or sometimes it's called ethos or personality. Some people call it urban charisma, a certain kind of, intangible cultural presence, which I think also is important to defining any given city.
Excellent, thank you very much. And where does your own inspiration to write about cities come from?
That's a great question. I think two places. Probably, firstly, I grew up in South Glasgow, sort of between South Glasgow and Paisley, and we grew up in pretty sort of low-income peripheral neighbourhoods in the city. Pollock, for example, it's a big suburban neighbourhood in South Glasgow, and I had from a young age a strong sense of urban inequality. That there was clear spatial differences around me. Areas of severe poverty, and then a few miles away, some of the wealthiest people in the big houses and the cars and all the rest of it. And I just felt very, very palpably a sense that this sort of drama of inequality was happening in this kind of spatial arena, and so that if you wanted to make a difference to people's lives, it had to happen here. Not to say that rural poverty doesn't exist, but the concentration of poverty and inequality in the city was just very sort of felt as I was growing up. And I think my family had a big influence on that, who were quite, come from a very broad sort of leftist critique of cities. And then the second thing was probably the university. I went to Glasgow University and worked with learned under some fantastic geographers at Glasgow University, people like Chris Philo and Joe Sharp and Paul Routledge and Roland Paddison, who's sadly no longer with us, and others who were brilliant teachers and who taught me that geographical thinking, thinking spatially, was an incredibly powerful way to understand the world, and that I could do that through cities and the places that I was growing up and experiencing all around me. So probably those were the two key impetus to want to study. Impetus or impeti? What's the plural of impetus?
It's an impeti, I think.
Impeti sounds like some kind of zebra or elephant or some kind of like. Sorry, we get off the topic. You're not going to keep that in, are you?
No.
Maybe you should. That's more interesting than the bit that we just did.
It's all really interesting. So, are cities for you places of hope or despair?
Are cities places of hope or despair? Well, I think it probably won't surprise you to say. Well, I think they're both. I don't know what you think, Antonis, but I think they're both, because I mean, big cities in particular are becoming more and more unequal, aren't they? Economically, spatially, that's increasing. And of course, the impact of climate change is really powerfully seen on cities and disproportionately affects the urban poor. So there's lots of reasons to feel quite bleak about cities. But at the same time, cities are the places where alternative ideas, resistance movements, possibility, cultural or political possibility is constantly being regenerated. So there has to be both, I think, isn't it? I would say lately it's felt that the despair element has been stronger than the hope element, given everything that's been happening, but the hope is still always there. I think so, yeah.
Yeah.
Don't you think?
I think so too. If you're asking me, for sure, what you mentioned also in the lecture, cities are about connections and links and kind of interrelationships. So the more fragmented they become, the less space there is for hope. But this is not to give up hope.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah, it's like in Star Wars, there's always hope. I think Luke says that.
I think so. Do people know? Yeah?
Sorry, Helen. Yes, more seriously.
Excellent. No, this is great. Well, speaking of Star Wars, maybe, what would be your idea of a utopian future city?
God, that's a good question. Cloud City. Utopians, I don't know if I don't, well, I mean, there was that great book by David Harvey, wasn't there, Spaces of Hope, I think it was called, which includes a long discussion of utopia and about trying to think about, of course there's a long tradition of thinking about utopia, and you can think about this in very practical ways. It doesn't have to be, sort of like Cloud City and unicorns. But I sort of feel like, I sort of feel a bit nervous about the whole language of utopia. I kind of feel like I'm much more comfortable talking about the good city or even the just city or rights to the city, these kinds of positions, these kind of normative positions.
Well, maybe what's the most exciting city for you today?
Oh wow, that's an amazing question. That's a really amazing question. Because I suppose some of the things I was just talking about around the good city, you could argue that we've seen them very strongly in Scandinavian cities, or at least some Scandinavian cities, where you have relatively strong commitment to public welfare, housing, infrastructure services across the entirety of the city. Of course, that is changing and it's eroding in all kinds of ways, and it always had exclusions built into it. But I suppose those are the examples where our mind often goes. Or somewhere like Havana, right, as an experimentation, but of course Havana is also materially very unequal in certain ways in terms of its built form. I think exciting, when I was growing up I would have said Glasgow, because it was the big city up the road and it was a place of endless possibility and overwhelming, and just the sheer buzz of all that going on. Like, there's something about cities generate that sense of atmosphere, that sense of this, just like the world is possible, things can change here, and I think Glasgow totally represented that for me. It was that was incredibly exciting growing up, and then I think during the first part of my career I was lucky enough to go to Mumbai to do research, and that was incredible, just an amazing kind of sense of all life is here, and culture, political experimentation that was going on, also incredibly unequal and sort of devastating city in many respects, but fascinating, sort of endlessly fascinating, worlds within worlds within worlds. That's Mumbai. It's a whole, many careers worth of work just trying to get your head around it. There's one ward in North Mumbai, I can't remember the name of, which I always tell my students is the population is bigger than Switzerland, and it's just this one quite small ward. So it's this incredible kind of mass agglomeration of people and lives and stories. And so that's in noise, and smells and all kinds of exciting things. So that was hugely important for me as a PhD student, then afterwards. And then the moment, it's going to sound really boring, but the moment I'm doing bits of work in London with various colleagues, and I'm really kind of seeing London differently. So I think it's quite interesting how cities that you think you know fairly well, and you maybe don't associate with being hugely exciting to you, you start to look at them from a different angle, sometimes through research projects with colleagues, sometimes through the eyes of colleagues. And you start seeing a different pulse, different sense of possibility, different groups doing interesting things. And so at the moment I'm quite excited about some of that work. And London feels quite an exciting place, but not to say that Mumbai isn't. But like, you know, it's interesting how some of those cities become, those more familiar cities change for you as you encounter them differently.
Excellent.
Sorry.
Well, I was in Glasgow
Yeah.
on a Saturday night 2 weeks ago, and I can definitely testify to it being
Yeah.
an amazing.
Absolutely, it is. I know it's fantastic. There's loads going on all the time. People are brilliant and friendly.
Yeah.
I mean, it's the best people in the world, isn't it? Glasgow.
I think it's true.
Did I mention I grew up there? Yeah. I'll just put that out there. It's, yeah.
It all makes sense now. Okay, so I guess our second last question, because I have one on behalf of Mike Simpson too, from this list is: do you think we will ever live in a post-urban world? And would you want that?
Would I want that? I don't know what that would look like. I'm reading G.G. Ballard's Drowned World. Have you read that? I'm only about halfway through it. I've never read it before, and it's sort of this kind of dystopian kind of. Solar radiation has destroyed the world, but it's a kind of like early example of thinking around what climate change might do to the world. And it's, you know, vastly flooded cities with skyscrapers sticking out of polluted lagoons, and, you know, radically transformed ecologies, different kind of human relationships to nature, new forms of habitats distributed across vast spaces in these kind of hubs and spokes, and it's kind of a really dystopian image of what could come. And you read it thinking, God, this could happen. You can imagine, you know, you can imagine these kinds of scenarios unfolding. That's a particular version of post-urban world that obviously you would hope would never happen. But I would say that I think, you know, if you look at the work people like Roger Kyle and others are doing, you know, and there's lots of people doing this work, cities are largely growing outwards, aren't they? You know, most urbanisation is happening on the peripheries, on the suburbs. So they're sort of sprawling out. And yes, there are cities that are densifying as well as sprawling, but the dominant urban form is going towards the sort of mega urban region. At the same time, most of the growth in numbers is happening in the small towns and cities as well. So which are kind of appearing kind of on the edges often of these sprawling cities with the suburbs growing out. So you can imagine a kind of like a sort of like network of hubs and spokes of urbanisation of different kinds with vast corridors and connections, where the city centre, the conventional kind of city centre sort of, you know that we imagine with places like Glasgow that we mentioned a moment ago, doesn't disappear but becomes less prominent in the cultural, political, economic fabric of everyday living because of these more distantiated, interconnected forms. At the same time, I think the pandemic taught us that people want cityness. You know, that you know, people miss the buzz of agglomeration of different kinds, economic, social, and cultural agglomerations, and that, you know, that desire to be in tight collectives isn't going to go away. So urbanism of some form will always be with us, whether it takes the form of a dominant form of cities today. You could see that potentially changing as we move towards this more peripheralized urbanization integrating over time. That would be my best hunch at the moment, Anthony. So, I mean, that's a good question. What do you think?
I have no idea.
Hold on, wait a minute. Was that an option? If I'd known you could have said that, I would have been talking about G.G. Ballard and lagoons. I would just have said, I don't know, next. Well, you did say at the start I could pass.
You could pass, but I honestly don't know. It's so difficult to, as you said with COVID, there was a moment when you really could see the beginning of the end of this density, right? You could, for once in our generation, we've endlessly heard about, that we don't really need this density anymore, that we've moved into this, transitioned into the post-urban world, the distances, location no longer relevant. And we saw that for a very fleeting moment, we saw that with COVID, and then we realized it was probably bullshit. People, as you said, they did need this.
Do you know what was interesting? We did some work during the pandemic, myself and some postgrads at Durham, where we interviewed online people in Newcastle, Liverpool, Birmingham, Manchester, across northern England basically, also in Edinburgh a bit. And we asked them how whether their perceptions of crowds had changed. And so this was sort of early 2021, and it was kind of amazing how many people came back to us and talked about how they felt they would never want to be in a crowd ever again, or if they were going to have to be in crowds, they'd be really quick about it and they'd never feel as comfortable. And this is people who love busy city centres, right? They love the kind of buzz of the city and the crowds. But now, here we are now, late 2022, I'm convinced that the vast majority of those people are just living their lives as they were pre-pandemic. Unless there's like a specific health problem, vulnerability, or long COVID or something like this, I'm convinced they're all going back. And if I showed them those comments now, they'd probably be like, was that me? I think it's amazing how quickly we have, as you said, that moment was fleeting. But when it was happening, it was really, really profound. There was a definite sense that the whole question of the city is up in the air. For some, right? I mean, there's a class element to this, isn't there? Because for a lot of people, they just had to live their lives the way they always live their lives, delivering stuff or whatever. And I think there's something really interesting about the human condition that we've learned from that we were able to go from that intensity of sort of fear of the crowd to and proclamations of we're never going back to now this. I'm still trying to get my head around the extent to which we transformed so radically in that time.
Yeah, collective memory and collective sort of action. We've seen all of this. This memory is so brief, so short. You're right. I mean, we've seen the same here in St Andrews, right? We've gone back to full in-person teaching, and the change happened just like that. And now you're suddenly back into packed lecture theatres and packed halls, corridors, students all around the town. And for the past 2 years, there was none of that. It's actually quite, and it's been a little bit. I feel the same. Like it's been a little bit uneasy for the first 2 weeks. I'm like, this doesn't feel right. I mean, it does and it doesn't. It doesn't feel normal. And now I think, was it week 3 of a term? It's already back to fully normal. Almost as if COVID never happened. You're right, except if it's for specific health conditions that people might have. Otherwise, it's nearly all gone. And I guess the broader kind of question that this raises about collective memories, this is just one instance, but then you see politically, this continent has experienced things that we thought we would never want to experience again, and it takes a generation, doesn't it? And we see, what happened in Italy, what's happening in Sweden. You see the rise of the far right in ways that you wouldn't have imagined would have happened even a decade ago. Yeah. So maybe this is like a small condensed version of this larger, fact of the human condition people forget collectively. But this has happened so fast. You're right. It's quite phenomenal.
Yeah. And I think the other thing it tells us is that you can't. The art of prediction is really a kind of fool's errand. Trying to predict where kind of the public mood's going or where politics is going. If the last decade has taught us anything, between, as you say, Sweden and Italy, through to COVID-19, Brexit, Boris Johnson, Liz Truss, and the whole kind of Corbyn moment in Labour, and more, and on and on and on across Europe and beyond, Trump and so on. Bolsonaro, Modi. You couldn't have predicted this 20 years ago. Well, maybe some people did, right? And some people will say they did. But the vast majority of us think we have some sense of surety about the future. And what, so if prediction is off the table in that sense, how do you think about the future, right? How do you populate notions of the future in the knowledge that actually you're living with radical uncertainty and that things can go in any number of different directions, and throw climate change into the mix and radical transformations in ecology and forms of living? Where does that leave us?
Yeah.
You know, let alone the future of the city. You know, where does that leave us?
Yeah, it's a very thought-provoking question, and even though we had promised ourselves that we're not going to be asking the questions about the presentation from our speakers, these were supposed to be more open, sort of general questions, but your lecture has been so inspiring to us and to Mike Simpson that I'm lending this question from sort of a variation of it. So, as he pointed out, your previous work was very much centered around notions. The notion of assemblage was very key, and a key kind of like principle behind assemblage is kind of like networking, this bringing together, this interconnectedness, right? And now you've moved to this work exploring the fragment, and at least at the surface, maybe not so much after you've unpacked it the way you did, the fragment is about breaking apart, right? It's about individuality, it's about segments, it's about differentiation and kind of like distance. So do you see a continuation between these two pieces of work, or is an actual fragmentation? Is there a rupture between what you did before and what you're doing now?
I think the kind of assemblage sort of moment in my own kind of work, which was sort of 2010, 11, so it feels like a long time ago, and the work I'm doing now, there are very strong continuities, because you know, there's a set of conceptual debates around assemblage and the sort of pros and cons and the limits of it, much of which has been sort of wildly over-exaggerated and overly kind of it's got itself bogged down into a kind of intellectual terrain of contestation and dispute, which sort of doesn't quite reflect the importance of the concepts, and it, you know, overstates the kind of stakes at play, I think. Misrepresents the similarities and connections across different traditions of thinking and critical scholarship, for example, creates dividing lines which don't really exist. So there is all that baggage there, which I'm frankly not interested in being involved in. I was involved in some of those debates, and it kind of ends up, quickly becomes like less about the debate and much more about certain claims about what intellectual camp you're in. You know, so there's a kind of curious kind of thing going on with assemblage and its place in geography and critical urban studies, which I don't think is actually very productive. Which is not to say that the concept isn't useful in the debate, and people are doing some fantastic work with that in different ways. So that's my own kind of position on it. But the whole point of, for me, the whole point of the conceptualization of assemblage was to think about the production of the urban world in ways that was open to the possibility of change. So you look at what I mean by that. What I mean by that is you look at the production of urban space, you know, sort of work I was doing at the time around sort of Mumbai sanitation politics, and you want to take seriously not just the human but the non-human, because the distribution of water pipes and toilets matters considerably to the way in which everyday life and politics take shape. Those non-humans at different points in different ways have agency. Right? You have to be very specific about how they have agency and why it matters, which is something I think that got a bit lost in the assemblage debate, partly because of my own misrepresentation of that. So that matters. So that's the first thing, taking seriously the non-human. Secondly, taking seriously process. In other words, an orientation to the urban world that recognises it's always in production, always in flux, and that flux, that movement across different timescales, can sometimes happen through surprising forms of change, right? Through contingencies that you might not expect. This goes back to what we were just saying about the way in which the world has changed for the last 10 years, right? I think we're hardwired in the critical social sciences to imagine that change happens through powerful actors, And quite often it does, but sometimes it doesn't, and in a surprising amount of times it doesn't, right? You know, all kinds of random stuff just goes on and throws everybody into disarray, right? Now the powerful might be best able to capitalize on that and to re-establish themselves, but that doesn't mean that they are always the agents of transformation. And so assemblage was another way of orientating yourself to the possibility that change can come from surprising places. So there's a non-human, there's contingency, and then I suppose the other orientation was around description, like trying to describe how things come together, how they're assembled, as a way of seeing where the weak points and the possibilities and the alternatives might be within the system, right, through that attention to description. So I think those are the three kind of like orientations, and I think those three orientations are still in my work. So in other words, I have a certain way of thinking about cities and urbanism, and assemblage was one way of pursuing it, and at the moment, well, lately, Fragments has been another way of pursuing it, but as you say, it goes in a slightly different direction. What it has in common with assemblage is that I'm interested principally in the relations around the fragment. So I'm interested in how fragments are pulled into different kinds of relations, not fragments necessarily in and of themselves, right? Not necessarily the thing itself, but how, for example, a water pipe or a broken toilet is made into a political object, or made into a different kind of political object, let's put it that way, for certain groups at certain times, right? So that's why I talk about the fragment as a verb. So in that sense, that relationality of the fragment is very similar to kind of like a conception of the processual notion of the assemblage, right? So there are those connections, but without, I think, some of the conceptual language and actual baggage of some of the assemblage debate, which I don't think has been hugely constructive for critical urban research at certain times.
Fantastic. This has been surprisingly clear, and when I say surprisingly, it's because the assemblage theory is one of the theories I had the most difficulty of understanding, but this makes total sense.
Well, there's other people writing about it much more clearly than me.
No, absolutely. Yeah. It's brilliant. Excellent. Thank you very much, Colin.